Hello everyone, welcome to today's class. The topic of today's class is Brief History of Environmental Change. This is the part 2. We have already covered the part 1 in the previous class. So before we get into the detail, let me give you the brief outline of today's class. So first we are going to focus on global warming and climate change. Secondly, we are going to understand how global warming has impacted the developing countries. And once the impact is clear to us, then we have to move towards the policy regime. So what developed countries can adopt and what developing countries can adopt as policies to combat this global warming and climate change. And at the end of the class, I am going to present a brief history of policy regimes. What are the policy regimes have been already undertaken at the international level that would be discussed towards the end of the lecture. So what are the learning outcomes of this specific class? So you'll get to have an idea about global warming, climate change, and the impact of global warming and the climate change, especially on the developing countries. Then to know about the policies from a developed countries perspective and from a developing countries perspective, and towards the end we'll also have the idea about the cooperation at the international level in terms of climate policies at the international level. Since this is the part 2 of this history of environmental changes lecture, so let me give you a quick recap. So what have we learned in the previous class? So you have already witnessed that since industrial revolution, this rising usage of fossil fuel burnings and then rising concentration of atmospheric carbon dioxide had happened. As a result, you have seen that the rising temperature at world level and rising sea level, and towards the end of the previous lecture you have seen how developing countries were severely affected because of this type of environmental changes. Now, what is global warming and what is climate change? I'm sure these days you are keep hearing these two terms quite often. So global warming refers to the long-term warming of the planet. As I have already shown in the previous lecture, that temperature is rising. The temperature of the entire world is rising. So this phenomena is known as global warming. Now what is climate change? So global warming is a part of the climate change. Climate change is much more bigger concept. So climate change actually encompasses the global warming, the phenomena. So, but it refers to the broader range of changes that are happening to our planet. For instance, we have witnessed already that sea level is rising, shrinking mountain glaciers, accelerating ice melt in various parts of the world, etc. So, all this event together is known as climate change, and the rising temperature of the planet is known as global warming. So, global warming can be thought of a subset of climate change. Now, the question is, what is the impact of climate change? So according to the Intergovernmental Planet on Climate Change report, so these are the following impact. So you would experience, or the economies or various countries would experience, severe heat waves, hurricanes, floods from heavy rains, prolonged droughts, losses of valuable species, crop and fishing losses, sea level rise, saltwater intrusion, shrinking mountain glacier, shift in flower blooming time. Impact on the economy. So displacement of people, loss of livelihood, declining crop yield, loss of forest, loss of employment opportunities, threaten to food security, and lack of access to fresh water. So these are the impact on the human lives and the various economies. For instance, let's say if there is rising sea levels, what will happen? So it would definitely jeopardize access to water, food and healthcare. Other than that, it would also destroy the livelihoods in key sectors or key industries such as agriculture, fisheries and tourism. And in addition to that, it would also cause damage infrastructure and communities, and it would happen globally. The data shows that 10% of the world population, that is approximately 900 million people, actually live in coastal areas which is less than above sea level. So if sea level keeps rising, you can understand that these people, they have to be displaced from their places from that their now residing place, they have to go to some other place, right? And for instance, if there is flood, there is hurricane or anything, so you I'm sure you have also come across this sort of example, that people do move out from their home if there is flood, so they go to the flood shelter, right? So that kind of a disruption of regular life will happen if climate change is actually, it happens, it generally would happen. Now let me give you one instance, or for instance one example here. So Cyclone Amphan, one of the strongest cyclones ever recorded, hit the Sundarbans region between India and Bangladesh in May 2020. It displaced 2.4 million people in India and 2.5 million people in Bangladesh. So it happened in our country only, right? So it happened in 2020. And there are example also, as you can see, the sea level, this is for Andaman and Nicobar, the sea level rise is estimated to be 5 millimeter per year, and this is unfortunately higher than the global average. As a result, what will happen? The coastal erosion would force people to relocate to a different place. So you can understand that if actually sea levels continuously rise, then lot of people will be affected because of this sea level rise. Their livelihood will be affected, their place of living would be affected, economy will be affected. IPCC report also presented the most vulnerable regions. Which are the most vulnerable regions? Sub-Saharan Africa, because of drying a spell, it would be like prolonged, they would experience prolonged droughts. Asian mega delta, so here we have the risk of sea level rising, risk of flood, etc. Then small islands and Arctic. So Asia you have already seen, so there are various countries in Asia like which are developing. For instance, India is still developing countries. Here I would like to talk about briefly about characteristics of developing countries. We know that per capita GDP would be quite lower level of living and productivity, higher level of inequality and absolute poverty. So number of poor people would be higher in a developing country. Population growth would be quite high, larger rural population, and there would be rapid rural to urban migration, and most of the population in this rural part would be dependent upon the agriculture sector. So these are a couple of characteristics of the developing countries, right? So there are a lot of researches have actually taken place on this issue of climate change. One of the very important piece of work is the Stern Review. Stern Review is telling us that poorest of developing countries will be hit earliest and hardest because of this climate change. Food production in the tropical region will be hampered, and people who are having low income, they would find it very difficult to adapt to the situation because they already in a lower income bracket. In this case, international community, they have to come forward to support them in this kind of a crisis. Now here I am just going to focus on poor people little bit, because as I have already said that most of the poor people are located in the rural area. Their main employment source is rain-fed agriculture. They live in the area which is like mostly stressed and environmentally risky. For instance, I gave already the data where you have seen the 10% of world population, they actually resides next to the river. Also their quality of house is not that great, poorly constructed, made with straw, bamboo, etc. So sometimes it may not stand with the heavy wind or heavy cyclone or heavy flood. Other than that, these poor people, they also don't have any insurance against any health hazard or any climate catastrophe, because they are already very poor. So now the question is, we can understand these poor people will be affected severely. So what can be done to combat this climate change, especially for the developing countries? Because as we have already seen, the Stern Review has already predicted that poor people in the developing countries will be affected severely. So what can be done? What policies we can offer so that this catastrophe can be taken care of? question, just remember, we have talked about greenhouse gas emissions, right, in the previous lecture already. So it is the greenhouse gas emission which is creating all these problems, right, and this is coming from already industrialized country, those who are already developed, and it is developing countries are also creating, because now developing countries also have to feed their poor people. Developing countries also have to grow, they have to catch up the developed countries, so they are already expanding their economy. So these are the two sources from where this greenhouse gas emission is coming from. And deforestation is also another source where this again is contributing to this greenhouse gas emission. Now this is the problem. So we have to somehow mitigate the greenhouse gas emission. How can we do that? So again, there are quite a few policies which can be taken forward. So one is the development of carbon markets. You can tax on carbon and establishing long-term quantity cap on greenhouse gas emission. So one strategy is mitigate. So we can formulate strategies in such a way that we have a cap. We can't go beyond that. So if you are going beyond that, there will be a trouble. That is one way. Now focus again on developing countries. As I have said, they have to industrialize because they are having already very large number of poor people. Poor people are within the developing countries. They are high level of like poverty and high level of inequality. So there is a section of society who are like impoverished, and they are mostly dependent upon agriculture and rain-fed agriculture. So rain is a very important factor. They don't have any clearly defined property rights. They don't have their own land or own resources. Also, mostly people might be agricultural labor or a marginal farmer. Developing countries will have other sorts of problem as well. So they have the problem of poverty, they have the problem of industrialization, they are generating lot of carbon dioxide through this industrialization process. They are also facing this global climate change and environmental degradation. Along with that, they also have the high population growth. So developing countries are having all these sorts of challenges, and so their policy mechanism also has to address all sorts of challenges. So first thing would be for industries particularly, we can have industrial abatement policies. So you can tax the emissions, right? If any industry is let's say doing some production, you can tax if they are emitting some pollutants. Then you can have tradable emission permits, you can have quotas, you can have standards, and also if some company or some industries is adopting any new technology which is actually giving benefit to the environment, the government can give them some tax credit and subsidies, etc. So this is the way one can think of supporting the industry so that they emit less amount of carbon dioxide. Now come to the second part, where we have a lot of poor population who are already dependent upon agriculture, and they don't have clear property rights. So if the basic idea is to give poor people a basic amount of income, then we need to give them some tenurial security. So even if a person who would like to invest on his or her land, they really can't do it because they don't know, since they are farming someone else's land, so they don't know whether after the investment they might get evicted from the land, right? So in that case, if the poor person or farmer, they have clearly defined property right, they can put some investment on their, it can be farming land or it can be their house as well. So for that, for rural and urban, in both places, we need to have a clearly defined property rights or resources for the poor people. So if that is there, then they can undertake investment on housing, sanitation, or on agricultural land. They can at least think of doing some investment in this stage. So if they can do that, this would also improve their living conditions and increasing agricultural investment. Then another factor we have seen that poor people, they are not having enough job opportunities. They are basically dependent upon agriculture. So one way could be you improve the agriculture sector, or you improve irrigation. So because mainly they are dependent upon the rain-fed agriculture. So if the government or if the poor person himself can invest on agriculture, then there is a possibility of getting some improvement in terms of their living conditions. So government can take initiative to subsidize credit program, or to subsidize some input, or maybe some new technology in farming also the government can give all sorts of support. Other than that, this is concerning to the farming sector. If we can also generate some amount of non-farm employment for these poor people, then they don't have to be rely upon to the land or maybe to the environmental resources so much. For instance, one can think of building infrastructure, local roads, ponds, etc. So that in a way would also create local jobs, and it would also alleviate the pressure on ecologically sensitive land. Another very important point here is this community involvement. So two things we can address through this kind of policies. One is we can preserve our environment, and second is we can also generate employment. So let's say you can do the reforestation, you can do expansion of mangrove. So you give the responsibility to the local poor. They would take care of the environment. So in a way they are also doing the job, they are getting paid back, and the environment is also being preserved. Other than that, one can think of constructing flood barriers, one can think of constructing let's say flood shelter, etc. So if all this initiative can be taken at the local level, so environment as well as this employment opportunities of the rural poor can also be taken care of. Very important policy initiative would be the raising the economic status of women. This would actually address the concern of high population growth. So if we can educate our women, so and if we can give them employment opportunities, that would in turn affect the fertility rate, and the household size might also decrease. Okay, and women education is always beneficial for, let's say, taking care of the child nutrition. So child mortality rate can also go down if women are much more educated. So that is another way one can think of declining high population growth, or to address the high population growth. So this was the set of policies which developing countries can think of. Now the question is, as we have already seen, it is the developed countries which actually contributed a lot towards its environment degradation. So what sorts of policies they can undertake at this point of time so that we can address the issue of climate change. Okay, so to answer this question, we have to keep in mind that developed countries, they already have a high per capita level of income. So they can give, or they can extend their help to the developing countries by giving them the market, right? What can be done in this regard? So developed countries, they often practice trade policies which actually restrict the market for the developing economics. So if the, let's say, developing countries, they would like to sell their product to the developed countries, it is not you can't do that because there are a lot of trade barriers. So developed countries can reform their trade policies, can open their market for the developing countries, so that developing countries can generate enough amount of resources and they can improve their condition of the poor people, or they can channelize their fund to the climate crisis as well. Another thing we have observed is that even if let's say developing countries are exporting their commodities to the developed nation, but they mainly generally export primary commodity, but the developed country, they already give lot of subsidy to their agriculture. As a result, developing countries are also losing out, they are not gaining much. So the trade policies for the developed countries need to be reformulated or organized in such a manner so that the developing countries can get the access to their market and can generate enough amount of income so that they can take care of any climate crisis back home. Second part is debt relief, right? This is a very important, this could be a very important policy prescription. So if developing countries, they have to pay high amount of debt to the developed countries, so obviously their funds is being channelized to any other direction. They can't undertake any investment, let's say for sustainable development purpose or to achieve sustainable goal. In this case, if the developed countries can give some amount of debt relief, then the developing countries can also channelize their fund to undertake the other various kinds of activity which would also focus on this or to address the environmental degradation. Development assistance can be another route by which the developed countries can actually help the developing countries. By development assistance, what do we mean? We mean some kind of investment for various types of purpose, for let's say for poverty alleviation or for to promote some sustainable development goals, or maybe to promote some sustainable production in agriculture or in any various other sectors. So if the developed countries are giving some amount of development assistance to the developing countries, that will always be beneficial for both of them actually. For instance, assistance might also be given to, let's say, to maintain the or to maintain and preserve the rainforest. So if you are actually putting money to preserve the rainforest, so it is actually rainforest is actually, I mean, it is giving the benefit to the entire world. It's not only to the developing nations. So in a way, you are actually contributing in the well-being of the entire world. So developed countries can think of this kind of assistance. Emission control, so they are already ahead of many developing countries, and they can think of strategies where they can control the emission, and they can also adopt technologies, clean technologies, where emission, greenhouse gas emission would be very minimized. Very important aspect is research and development. Developed countries are already having higher level of human capital, so they can invest in this research and development. They can create knowledge or technologies to how to produce in a very sustainable manner, so that we can have a sustainable production process, and we generate less amount of greenhouse gas. Not only that, their duty would also be to give these kinds of technology in a very lower rate to the developing countries. They have to make them available to the developing countries so that the developing countries can also use them in their production process. Now, the question is, this can be done, this we are saying from the developing countries perspective and from the developed countries perspective. Now here I am going to ask you one simple question. What has been done to address the environmental crisis at the global level? Have we already undertaken various policies, or what is the role of the developing and developed countries both? That we are going to discuss next. The UN Scientific Conference on the Conservation and Utilization of Resources, it happened in 1949. At this point of time, there was no recognition of climate crisis or climate change as such. They actually talked about this depletion of those resources and their use. Okay, their main objective was to how to manage them for economic and social development. There was no conservation perspective involved at that point of time. This happened in 1949. Then the Economic and Social Council on 29th May 1968, and there they include those issues in its agenda as a specific item, and this is the first time they are holding a conference, or first United Nations conference on the human environment. The first Earth Summit, which happened, which was held in Sweden from 5th to 6th June 1972, and they adopted a declaration that set out principles for the preservation and enhancement of the human environment, and an action plan containing recommendations of international environmental actions. So 1972 onwards, as you can see, they started giving the recommendation, so how to go forward with the environmental action. So this was the year when the issue of climate change for the first time was recognized, and warning, also there was given warnings to the government to be mindful of activities which actually is affecting our environment. And also climate change was first in this many years, first time it was recognized. Okay, the UN General Assembly in 1987, it adopted the environmental perspective to the year 2000 and beyond. So this is a framework to guide national action and international cooperation on policies and programs aimed at achieving environmentally sound development. Okay. The perspective underlined the relationship between environment and development, and for the first time introduced the notion of sustainable development. If you remember the lecture on your sustainable development, so this is the first time at an international level we are recognizing the need for sustainable development. Montreal Protocol, this is very important. The Montreal Protocol, what is that? Is an international protocol to the Vienna Convention agreed in 1987 before entering into force in 1989. Its purpose was to phase out, reduce and eventually eliminate the use of man-made ozone depleting substances for protection of the ozone layer. If you remember the graph from the previous lecture where we have shown you that ozone graph was declining, that was because of this Montreal Protocol. Then 1992 we have this Rio Earth Summit. This is very important, and here we are like the world leader, they have adopted a series of international environmental agreements, including the United Nations Framework Convention of Climate Change, which is also known as in short form UNFCCC. Okay, so mostly all the countries have an agreement with, the agreement has been embraced by almost all the countries. Okay, what is the purpose of setting this framework? So it sets a long-term objective of avoiding dangerous human interference with the climate system. Okay, so main objective was that all nations, they have to take steps to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. That was the main objective of this framework. And so governed by this conference of parties which meets annually. So since this time onwards we have annual meeting, this is called COP. So the UNFCCC serves as the foundation of an evolving global climate effort. So all the countries together, they sit together and then they discuss which needs to be done, what is the target, etc. And it happens each and every year. Kyoto Protocol is another important thing. Kyoto Protocol was adopted in at COP3 in 1997. The agreement incorporated a series of flexible or market-based mechanisms enabling developed countries to use different forms of emissions trading to achieve their target more cost effectively. So target is you have to reduce greenhouse gas, but how we are going to do? So Kyoto Protocol is telling us that market-based solution can be adopted by the developed countries. Then COP15 in Copenhagen in 2009, where we are getting the Copenhagen Accord. What is that? So it set a goal of limiting global temperature increases to 2 degrees. Okay, so what is the target? Target is 2 degrees. And it called on all countries to put forward mitigation pledges. So all country has to take the pledge that okay, we are with you, we are going to reduce the global temperature to 2 degrees. Okay, at COP16, that is the next year, the COP16 where Cancun agreements is taking place, where effectively formalizing the essential elements of Copenhagen Accord under the UNFCCC. COP21 in Paris, which happened in 2015. Here we actually adopted the Paris Agreement. The agreement represents a hybrid of top-down Kyoto approach and the bottom-up of the Copenhagen and Cancun agreements. The latest one, there are a lot of COPs have been happening, but I am presenting the latest one. This is COP 27 2022, which happened in Egypt. Here they have decided to talk about this climate finance. As expected, this was a key part of COP27. The final agreement highlights that 4 to 6 trillion US dollars need to be invested in renewable energy until 2030, including investment in technology and infrastructure to allow us to reach net zero emissions by 2050. So 2050, we are aiming for net zero emissions. Now, what are the impacts of these international treaties? This map is actually showing us the countries subscribed to the Montreal Protocol. This is a 2013 picture. As you can see, most of the countries, they have subscribed to Montreal Protocol. Now, this graph also appeared in the last lecture. Since we have adopted Montreal Protocol, that's why we are right now, at this blue graph. So, because of this Montreal Protocol, the ozone layer depletion, we could actually prevent the ozone layer depletion, and the Montreal Protocol, because of that, this excess skin cancer had gone down. And since we have also adopted Copenhagen Amendment, that has also worked in our favor. Okay, so this is the graph of global greenhouse gas emissions and warning scenario. If there was no climate policies, then what would have been the temperature? It would have gone up to 4.1 to 4.8 degrees centigrade. Now, with this temperature, there are a lot of displacement, but now you can imagine what would have been happened. With current policy regime, we are at this stage where we are having 2.5 to 2.9 degrees centigrade, but our target is 2 or below 2, right? So we are hoping, so it shows that whatever treaties and agreements or international cooperation had taken place, it shows that it worked. So climate change, it is real. It has already started showing its impact. So now either we have to mitigate or we have to adapt. So this is a very serious concern for for the entire world. So we are almost towards the end of the lecture. So what are the take-home points for this lecture? So you got to have an understanding of global warming and climate change. And as we have discussed, that developing countries and within developing countries, the poor population will be severely, they are already affected, and they will be severely more affected if you are not taking any policies. So policies have to be taken, policies have to be adopted at the local level as well as at the global level. So developing countries will have to take some set of policies, and developed countries also have to take different sets of policy. But the main objective would be to mitigate and adapt the climate change. And lastly, this lecture is also showing us that there was historically the climate, even if not to start with, but eventually the climate change actually got the international attention, and people or all the world leaders or all the other countries, they are thinking about it. They are coming up with proposals, they are coming up with treaties and coming up with various types of policies, and it had also have some impact. Already impacts are showing, especially with this ozone layer depletion. That graph was quite hopeful. So with this, we are ending this lecture. Thank you.